Okay, so today we are taking a deep dive into Indian federalism.
Sounds good.
So we're working from this chapter on federalism in this book, Indian Constitution at Work.
Okay.
And this should be really interesting because Indian federalism, as I'm sure you know, has a lot of really interesting quirks.
Right.
And it's a really diverse country, so they've had to come up with a lot of really interesting solutions to problems that other countries haven't really had to face.
Yeah.
So, I guess to start off, the chapter opens by talking about how lots of federations have failed, like the USSR, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia.
Right. Right.
And it's interesting because it seems like they are saying that India looked at these federations when they were creating their constitution.
Yeah, it seems like they were trying to learn from the mistakes of others.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that makes India so successful. So, what do you think, like, what's the key takeaway from that you see?
Well, I think it's that federalism, like it looks good on paper,
Hmm.
but making it work in the real world, with real people, real politics,
Yeah.
that's the real challenge.
Yeah.
And India, they seem to get that. They understood that from the beginning, I think.
Yeah, and that it's a process. Exactly. And then like a constant back and forth.
Right. It's a negotiation, always evolving.
So how does that play out in India specifically? Because, we're talking about this in theory, but how does it actually work? How did they set it up?
Well, they had this whole idea of unity and diversity, right? Like a fundamental principle.
Huh.
And you could see how that plays into their federal structure, how they divide powers between the central government and the states.
So it's like how much power do you give to the center versus how much autonomy do you give to the states?
Exactly. And they use this analogy of the skeleton and flesh and blood, right?
Right.
The Constitution is like the skeleton. It provides the framework, but then you need the flesh and blood of politics, of actual governance
Yeah.
to make it all work.
Right, because otherwise it's just like a dead thing. Yeah.
Exactly. It has to be a living, breathing system.
So how does that actually look in practice? Like how did they divide up the power in the Indian system?
Well, they have these lists, right? The union list, the state list, and the concurrent list.
Okay, yeah, I remember those.
So the union list, that's where the central government has the power to make laws. Things like defense, foreign affairs, currency, the big important stuff.
Makes sense. You want some consistency on those big issues.
Right. Then you have the state list, and this is where the states get to flex their muscles a bit. Agriculture, police, local government, things that might need to be handled differently in different parts of a country as diverse as India.
Yeah. What works in Kashmir might not work in Kerala.
Exactly.
So that's where things get interesting, right? Because if you have all these different states doing their own thing, I mean, how do you make sure everyone's on the same page?
Well, that's where the concurrent list comes in. These are areas where both the central government and the states can make laws. Things like education, forests, trade unions.
Okay, so that's like the gray area where it could get a little messy.
Exactly. And that's where you start to see some of the conflicts and tensions that the chapter talks about.
Oh, so this is where the drama starts. We've got to hear more about this.
Yeah, so we're talking about things like demands for autonomy, disputes over resources, center-state relations. It's a whole lot of political maneuvering.
Okay, so it's like a game of tug of war, but with like actual states pulling on the rope.
Exactly. And the stakes are high. For example, the chapter talks about disputes over river water. You have
Yeah.
different states, all depending on the same river, but there's only so much water to go around, right?
Right. It's like that old saying, whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting over.
Exactly. And it's not just water. The chapter highlights how these kinds of disputes pop up in all sorts of areas, linguistic tensions, regional rivalries, you name it.
Yeah, like that whole thing with each linguistic group wanting their own state. It's like, where do you draw the lines?
Exactly. It's a constant balancing act for the central government, trying to keep everyone happy while also maintaining some sense of national unity.
It's like they're walking a tightrope, right? One wrong step and the whole thing could come crashing down.
It really is. And the thing is, India has actually created new states over the years in response to these demands for linguistic and cultural recognition.
So it's not just like a static system. They're actually willing to redraw the map to try to address these tensions.
Exactly. It shows a certain flexibility, a willingness to adapt. But then, of course, you have the case of Jammu and Kashmir.
Ah, yes, Jammu and Kashmir. Now, that's a whole other can of worms. I remember learning about it in school, but it always seems so complicated.
Yeah, it's definitely a complex issue with a long and tangled history. Basically, for decades, Jammu and Kashmir had this unique status within India. It had its own constitution, its own flag, and a greater degree of autonomy than any other state.
Really? So it was like its own little country within a country. How did that even happen?
Well, it goes back to the time of India's independence and partition. But anyway, the key thing is that this special status was enshrined in Article 370 of the Indian Constitution.
Okay, so Article 370, that's the magic word.
Pretty much. And for a long time, it was a bit of a sacred cow in Indian politics.
Yeah.
But then, in 2019, everything changed.
What happened? Did they finally decide to, like, have a statewide referendum or something?
Not quite. The Indian government decided to revoke Article 370, just like that.
Wow, that's a bold move. So no more special status for Jammu and Kashmir.
Nope. It was brought fully under the control of the central government, just like any other state.
Wow, I bet that went over like a lead balloon with some people.
You bet. It was incredibly controversial. Some people saw it as a long overdue correction, a way to finally integrate Jammu and Kashmir fully into India.
Right, like they were finally ending a historical anomaly.
Exactly. But then, of course, you had others who condemned it as a blatant power grab by the central government.
They probably saw it as a betrayal, right? Like you're going back on your word and undermining our identity.
Exactly. It's hard to say who's right or wrong in this situation. It's a complex issue with deep historical roots and strong emotions on all sides.
So where does that leave us with Indian federalism today? I mean, we've got river disputes, linguistic tensions, Kashmir. It sounds like a recipe for disaster. So where does that leave us with Indian federalism today? I mean, we've got river disputes, linguistic tensions, Kashmir. It sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Well, it's definitely a work in progress, but I think what's remarkable is that despite all these challenges, India has managed to hold it together for over 70 years.
That's true. I guess it's easy to focus on the conflicts and forget that, like, hey, this system is actually working.
Exactly. And the chapter kind of hints at this idea that maybe the conflicts are actually a sign of a healthy democracy.
Interesting. So, like, if everything was always hunky-dory, it might mean that people are being silenced or something.
Right. Maybe a little bit of friction is actually a good thing. It shows that people feel empowered to voice their concerns, to fight for their rights.
That makes sense. But still, there has to be some kind of glue holding it all together, right?
Yeah.
What's the secret sauce of Indian federalism?
Well, the chapter doesn't give a simple answer,
Mm-hmm.
but it does talk about the importance of dialogue, negotiation, and compromise.
So it's not about finding some perfect formula. It's about being willing to, like, actually talk to each other and work things out.
Exactly. And also about recognizing that different regions have different needs, different priorities.
Right. It's about embracing that diversity, not trying to erase it.
Absolutely. And that's a constant process, a constant negotiation. It's not something you achieve overnight.
It's like a garden, right? You can't just plant the seeds and walk away. You've got to tend to it, nurture it.
I love that analogy.
Mm.
And just like a garden, the fruits of that labor can be incredibly rewarding.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Indian federalism, what's the one big takeaway you hope our listeners are left with?
That federalism is not a spectator sport. It's something that requires active participation from everyone. It's about understanding your rights, engaging in dialogue, holding your elected officials accountable.
It's about recognizing that the story of Indian federalism is still being written, and that we all have a role to play in shaping its future.
Beautifully said.
Well, on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the enduring experiment that is Indian federalism. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.